Hello and welcome to AQA GCSE Sociology, Feminism. Before we begin, you may want to think about what feminism actually is. Feminism is incredibly diverse and is not one monolithic thing. So it's not just something like, the suffragettes and onwards. You have first, second and third wave feminism, and you have radical feminism, and you have Marxist feminism, you have liberal feminism, and they all have different takes on the relationship between men and women. The main thread that runs through all of feminism really is the idea of women's role and status in society being equivalent to men, or being oppressed and controlled and dominated by men historically, and the battle to fight that. That's sort of A-level and degree depth anyway. What you really need for GCSE is this understanding really of the relationship between men and women and what that really means, and the fact that feminists see this as a conflict. They are conflict sociologists, so they automatically will differ from functionalists who are consensus. The family and the household is a primary area of feminist scrutiny and critique. So the family and the traditional nature of the family, and the nuclear family particularly, is where feminists see women at their most exploited, perhaps you could argue. So Delphi and Leonard are radical feminists writing in 1977 at a time where Young and Wilmot's symmetrical families has been in its infancy, and they would disagree with that. They would say that men, rather than capitalists, rather than business owners, they benefit the most from women's labour. Now, the fact that men might be both those things shouldn't be lost on you, but really it's in the home. Women work unpaid in the home, and that's the expectation of society, that's the expectation of men, and women are conditioned to believe that's the way it should be. They have to carry out household tasks, and it's not shared with their male partners. So if you think of the stereotype of perhaps the man takes the bins out because that's more demanding and physical. But it's a very short-lived task, whereas women, bending down, scrubbing floors, dusting, cooking and cleaning would be seen as not that labour-intensive perhaps. So feminists would see this as exploitation. It's an example of patriarchy. Oakley took this up in 1982 and said that the family, essentially, the nuclear family, it puts strains on everybody, but particularly women, and this plays into this idea of the double shift, particularly working class women who had to go out and work, perhaps in a part-time role, and still run the household. Middle class women could afford to look after their kids, could afford to stay at home and look after their house, or even afford a cleaner to do it for them, so it wasn't such an issue. So class and gender really come into play in the family, and the nuclear family and different family types then play upon feminist ideas. So be very mindful about what type of family you're talking about in your essays, how that might play into gender roles, and what that might mean. So when it comes to socialization and canalization, perhaps men and women being forced into being more manly or more ladylike, for want of better terms, that would be an area too where feminists would critique and look to explain patriarchy and male dominance. There isn't a feminist study that you need to know for education, but you need to know about feminism. It doesn't mean in an essay you should totally ignore the feminist view. The two areas you really want to think about are education itself and then the outcomes of education employment. For the last 40 years or so, girls have outperformed boys at school. Yet when they go to get jobs, women have what's known as a glass ceiling. They don't have access to the top jobs. Feminists would obviously be very critical of this. Education itself is seen as feminized. Subjects are gendered. So you have maybe child development is a girl subject and PE is a boy subject. And this again interests feminists because of gender stereotypes, labeling, stigma, that type of thing. So there will be questions, there will be essays where you can really explore the feminist view and use it as a really good contrast. And you can add that in rather than making it a focus perhaps. So reflecting back on functionalist and Marxist ideas here. Obviously you may want to think about the fact that women were denied education, particularly early on for centuries, as they were denied a lot of other things. So It's in keeping with feminist ideas about patriarchy and male dominance that really the 20th century saw the most progress and the most changes. There are two studies that you need to know when it comes to the feminist views on crime and deviancy. First off, Haydn's own writing in 1985 on women and crime, and then Pat Carlin writing in 1998 on women and crime. Both can be used to talk about control theory and the idea that because men control all aspects of society and all aspects of women's lives, this is the same when it comes to crime. So the reason that women commit fewer crimes than men is simply that they're dominated by men. You have the ideas of bedroom culture and the ideas of the housewife being so universal and so powerful. Women aren't allowed out of the house. It's difficult for them to commit crime physically. That's a really interesting idea from Haydn's own, and it shows that within the home they're still exposed to being victims of crime, such as domestic abuse and male violence. Carlin goes into the ideas of a class deal. She looked at working class women particularly, those are the most vulnerable in society, having to make a rational choice. If the breadwinner in a traditional household is no longer there, whether they themselves are in prison or whether they're left or they're no longer alive or whatever it might be, if a woman is left on her own or is a single parent, she may have to make a rational choice to turn to crime. This is part of the class deal, this is part of the gender deal, and it may be risky crime, it may be sex work of some sort, it may be something where she has to use sexuality and exploit that and turn to crime because that's the only option men leave her. There's a lot to unpack here, but essentially the feminist view of crime is that women are exploited by men, controlled by men, and something like the chivalry thesis no longer exists. You may argue that women generally get lighter sentences still. You may see that, but feminists would reject that, perhaps, or would argue that that's because they're so necessary for men. They can't be in prison, they need something else. It's a very controversial issue and not one that I really want to give a strong opinion on either way, but the feminist view is fascinating here, and one that you can really use in essays to explore this alongside Marxists and functionalists, because again you can combine class with gender, you can combine status with gender, you can combine power with gender, and look at the rules and the exceptions. If you think about the Ruth Ellis case, for example, and the fact that she had to be hanged by letter of the law, but it sparked a huge outcry, that's a good case study which predates both of these studies by a long way as well. So it perhaps shows there is historical precedent before that. So tying this all together, the social stratification module has Wolby's idea on theorising patriarchy, and this really reflects every single element that we've talked about in one study. Patriarchy is central to our understanding of society. The rule of men, the dominance of men, means that that's how we understand society. Now, there are exceptions to this throughout history. There are tribal cultures in, say, Papua New Guinea where they're matriarchal. There's parts of Caribbean society that are matriarchal, particularly the home. But generally speaking, when we think of this, when we think of most of the world, most of history, patriarchy is how society then organises itself, or the effects of patriarchy, the demands of it, I should say. So women have access to public life, but they're segregated into low-paid, low-status jobs. If you think about women throughout history, even the most high-status ones, it's very rare for them to have much power, or them not to be controlled or questioned because of their gender. So this is a really interesting study and a really interesting point back from 1990. And Wolby's study really encapsulates all of the issues we've talked about, from family, education and crime. So you may think about examples where women have been marginalised because they haven't wanted to be a housewife, or they haven't felt that even though they've succeeded in school and got good grades, they can go into the top jobs, and that can be seen as the after effects of patriarchy. So really what we're seeing overall from the feminist view is that male dominance and male oppression is so pervasive, so strong and so powerful, it colours and affects everything. And that really brings us round to where feminism is looking, regardless of the specific type of feminism. I hope you found this useful. Please leave me any comments or questions. Please feel free to correct me. Let me know if there's anything else that you need to know. Thank you very much for listening.